I'm not seeking penance for what I've done, Father. And I'm asking forgiveness for what I'm about to do.
Maybe it isn't only about justice, Matt. Maybe it's about you having an excuse to hit someone.
I can't see.
I thought that God let me hear the prayers
You hit them and they get back up. I hit them and they stay down.
so that I could answer.
You saved my life.
I'd rather die as the devil than live as Matt Murdock. I'm Daredevil.
Often attributed as a violence expert, Dr. Peter Foggy connected our violent nature to the Great Depression, where even in abundant poverty there haven't been the same rates of violence compared to what we see now. According to him, violent people can momentarily lose empathy.
Because what we have learned is that the way we become people is having someone around who is thinking about us as a thinking and feeling person.
Behind all the unnecessary repetition in our world's climate, violence is always behind our restless curtains. To understand the psychology of violence, we must examine why it's the only prehistoric tendency we have continued to manifest. And with such a vast topic, we'll never be able to scratch the surface. But with a show like Daredevil, each season tips different scales of violence for entirely different reasons, providing glimpses of how our unpredictable nature can be cultivated. So let's begin with the one and only Season 1, Childhood Trauma. There was this case study on punishment done by Dr. John D. Rich Jr., where there were kids at a lunchroom table talking and laughing, and beside them was a teacher who wasn't fond of their noises. We'll call him Mr. Smith. As he goes up to them, eyes tensed, fists clenched, he shouts, "Quiet!" And the children momentarily look at him, and without a second glance, they resume their chat. He repeats the same phrase and nobody responds. So what does he do? He tells them, "Okay, silent lunch for your table." And though they'd obey, there'd be chatter here and there. But Mr. Smith never refused to leave his finger on their pulses. So the key question is, do you think these kids respected him? Or were threatened by him? I think this complements Matt Murdock's tumultuous relationship with the court of law. The lines that are blurred in being a lawyer aren't as rewarding when the outcomes aren't being matched. When the system isn't being met, it breeds resentment. And that is how a character like Daredevil is born. Matt acts upon impulses that feel exciting, but to him, they toe the line just enough to bring him retribution. But this all starts somewhere, and for him, that included childhood trauma. What makes childhood trauma different from any other kind of trauma isn't the content of the event, but rather its lasting impacts. Studies have shown that children who experience trauma are unable to articulate their troubled emotions. They cloud their value as unnecessary and demoralized. And even if they see a caregiver as a guiding light, they don't wish to say much for fear of being a burden. As the show continues, you can feel a contrast between Matt talking about his childhood in the form of nostalgia.
She used to say, "Be careful of the Murdock boys. They got the devil in them."
And in the form of resentment.
I knew that I was alone in this world. You were never alone. Yes, I was!
And when it tends to go unrecognized or untreated, it leads to long-term consequences that can persist well into adulthood. Believe it or not, resilience is about targeting the dysfunction and alleviating its pressure. Techniques include talking through it, maintaining passions, discovering your ultimate gift. And as a devout Catholic, Matt was brought up thinking his abilities came from God's plan. And through his traumatic experiences, he never wanted to give up on a city that can easily let him down. But as the son of a boxer, at the end of the day, his primal urge is to win. Furthermore, the American Psychological Association describes trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event. There are three kinds of trauma: There's acute trauma, which is when you are suffering a single stressful event. Chronic trauma is when there's exposure to repeatedly stressful events. And then there's complex trauma, which deals with multiple and separate traumatic events. And I think that beyond his childhood, Matt will be placed in the complex trauma section because he has been exposed to multiple traumatic events that often relate to one feeling: abandonment. But the issue stems from how much he believes it's his fault, that he's some burden. Matt's struggle isn't just about violence, it's about connection. This relates to John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth's work on attachment theory. The study acknowledges that infants form emotional bonds with caregivers that can later influence their development and future relationships. So in the case of Matt, he can have friendships and relationships and is all around socially malleable, but he's never been able to trust others due to his experiences with primary caregivers. Having lost his father, been abandoned by his mother, had an emotionally unavailable mentor, and a self-destructive relationship, he was taught that attachment is only masqueraded into pain, and that form of rejection must be targeted somehow. And in his case, this was the result. Even if he has people by his side, he believes that suffering is a badge he can only wear, a fate he's destined to right.
I gave my sweat and blood without complaint because I too believed I was God's soldier. Well, not anymore. I am what I do in the dark now. I bleed only for myself.
When Matt inflicts violence, he is impaired with any objective justification except
This city needs me in that match fight.
the same way he needed someone to protect him. As physician Gabor Mate once concluded, trauma is a psychological wound that you sustain, a defense against reality and being judged.
I think the truth is it's complicated. I'm talking about whether he enjoys it or whether he doesn't. And the truth is I think he does and he doesn't. And figuring out what that line is both an incredibly scary prospect for him. And I think he probably has never quite asked himself that question entirely because he's afraid of what the answer might be.
Season 2, Cognitive Dissonance. For those unaware, cognitive dissonance was developed by social psychologist Leon Festinger as the psychological discomfort arising from conflicting beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors. In Season 2, Matt encounters Frank Castle, also known as the Punisher, a man whose moral code for violence is revenge. There's almost an internal codependence when it comes to cognitive dissonance. As Charlie Cox briefly mentioned before, characters like Matt or Frank become attached to their justification to avoid discomfort. They hold on to their conviction despite the moral evidence. To avoid dissonance, our beliefs and attitudes must work together consistently, because the origins of cognitive dissonance come from a consistent inconsistency. In other words, the only constant is contradiction, a distorted sense of reality. Matt can say that he doesn't enjoy being Daredevil. He can justify that it's the city he wants to save. But his impulses will always say otherwise. Frank can say that avenging his family will satisfy him, but he's still aware that the loss will never be returned to him. Fighting for a greater good always comes with its own set of challenges, but lying through your teeth brings you in no other direction but down. Frank knows what he wants, and while vindication rarely leads to tangible results, he sincerely believes it will give him closure. And I think that violence is a misguided attempt to bring closure. The infliction of pain always has a cause and effect, yet it never achieves a thoughtful resolution, but rather a failed outcome. The only result is his own fabricated sense of domination. There's a term called emotional pollution that brilliantly discusses this. It's when your emotions build into a volcano, melting with pressure, billowing with anger and fire until it pours without a second to reconsider. A great example is the infamous conversation between Matt and Frank. Both show a contrast in wanting justice, but their approaches are quite different. And the reason is that Matt, as irrational as he can be, has a better composure than most, which means that he doesn't easily get emotionally polluted. Frank, on the other hand, has emotionally polluted an entire climate of people. For someone programmed to follow orders, he believes the job must be done. And by the end of their conversation, Matt gave him some scarring words.
You're unhinged. There is goodness in people, even in you. And you're gonna have to kill me because I'm never gonna stop coming for you until I take you down. You wanna know why? Why's that? Because you're insane.
And after multiple viewings, I realized that because of his heightened senses, he could feel Frank's dissonance as he projected this grueling monologue. To Frank, losing his family lost any essence of reality. And as psychologist Dr. Reed J. Deitzman once mentioned, when angry, we are rewarded by the pain or discomfort of the victim. Research has shown that those who inflict aggression enjoy the revenge on someone who has wronged them. So in other words, they view it as a positive sensation called reward circuits, which scientists later discovered is connected to addiction. They argue that aggression is in the same group as drug use, gambling, and overall dangerous behavior. So whenever Matt feels out of control, his way of staying in control is by hitting people. But whenever Frank feels out of control, his way of staying in control is having his victims perish. But it goes back to small rewards rather than significant victories. So even if they achieve a huge victory, there isn't as much excitement compared to these small acts of justice. Season 3. The Cycle of Abuse. Before we talk about the cycle of abuse, let's quickly discuss the social learning theory. It all started from an experiment by psychologist Albert Bandura called the Bobo doll experiment. The crux of this study was bringing in 72 children divided into 3 groups of 24 each. One group observed an adult simulating violence by hitting the Bobo doll left and right, testing how much they would imitate similar tendencies. Another group watched a non-aggressive adult play calmly, while a control group had no model to observe. And believe it or not, there was a contrast. It turns out that children are more prone to violence based on observation, whereas those who don't witness nonviolent tendencies are less prone to aggression. Could it perhaps come from an adult's provoked influence, a limited exposure to social behavior, or perhaps a genetic malady? Well, now we arrive at Wilson Fisk, also known as the Kingpin. Growing up with an abusive father, as Bandura's theory suggests, exposure to violence in childhood can shape one's behaviors. Observation can be the catalyst of our human nature, and Bandura describes 3 kinds of observational learning. The first is a live model, which is when you're in close proximity to the behavior. The second is a symbolic model, which is when you consume outside information such as books, films, television, online media, etc. And the final one is a verbal instruction model, which is when someone describes the behavior to someone who isn't aware of the behavior. For instance, if you have never heard the word angry before and someone said, "That's when you're happy," you tend to believe that definition before you hear anything else. And on this topic, Bandura once stated, "Fortunately, most human behavior is learned observationally through modeling. From observing others, one forms an idea of how new behaviors are performed. And on later occasions, this coded information serves as a guide for action." Fisk's father also instilled something in Wilson called vicarious reinforcement, which is an association of watching another person find some act rewarding and imitating the same temptation. So even if it's an act of violence, when you're a child with no clear worldview, it's safe to say that you can believe anything is rewarding if you've never experienced its punishment. But you can see from the beginning that he was a kid who his father incessantly ridiculed. Bill Fisk taught him that violence was an act of righteousness, a man's way of committing themselves to a better life. This arrogance doesn't provide a momentary feeling of any vindication, but rather this formula that creates continued harm. This is where psychologist Lenore Walker discusses the cycle of abuse, which is derived from how interpersonal violence can be presented into 4 stages: tension building, incident, reconciliation, and calm. In the tension building phase, we begin to witness an abuser's growing manipulation, much like the relationship between Fisk and Dex Poindexter, also known as Bullseye. Fisk preys on Dex like the vulnerable target he is, observing his loneliness, trauma, and need for guidance as an opportunity to seek revenge. The incident phase occurs as Fisk orchestrates violent acts for Dex to conduct. Things like framing him as Daredevil and invariably turning him into a weapon. And though this portrays more emotional abuse, it can be just as destructive as Fisk is diminishing Dex's agency. The reconciliation phase is when you fabricate a false notion that was previously presented. Things like showering the person with compliments and validation, and in this case, making Dex believe that Fisk is the only one who gets him. Finally, in the calm phase, once Dex feels accustomed to Fisk's world, tension builds again, with Matt revealing the hidden truth behind Fisk's motivation, which is that he was, in fact, using him. But surprise, surprise, the cycle resets, and since the damage has been done, what once was an abused victim becomes the abuser himself. Vindication is the purest act of salvation for an individual's troubled upbringing. Fisk took the same rulebook his father instilled, but instead of wallowing in self-worth or carving a path to healing himself and others, he continued the lineage of a corrupted anarchist. In Season 3, we visibly witness an arc that begins with despair, continues to hunger, and then ends with acceptance, on every character's playing field. In particular, Matt and Fisk share a similar upbringing in the events they endured, but with entirely different environments and outlooks. While Matt comes from pursuing truth and justice rather than domination, Fisk wishes to bring force upon his adversaries. Because deep down, there's still this frightened little boy who believes that when things are taken away, bringing something back comes with tearing something down.
So what really matters is seeing somebody up there.
You will go back to prison, and you will live the rest of your miserable life in a cage, knowing you'll never have Vanessa.
And feeling yourself down here.
That this city rejected you. It beat you. I beat you.
That is what triggers a violent response.
As our emotions evolve, we have the power to bring positive regard instead of undesired conflict. But sometimes everything is clouded. Violence not only stems from being powerless, but also fearing a lack of value. We approach every aspect of our lives financially, emotionally, and socially with great priority. But whenever we are wronged, it can truly alter our identity. Violence strikes no bounds. It festers, it crawls, it can even cry for help, and shows like Daredevil forces us to confront how it begins and how it ends.
God's plan is like a beautiful tapestry. And the tragedy of being human is that we only get to see it from the back. With all the ragged threads and the muddy colors. We only get a hint at the true beauty that would be revealed if we could see the whole pattern on the other side, as God does.